moved on and you're just stuck with me. So, thank you. Thank you for that. But it was a good month, wasn't it? That's good. So, what I have foreseen for the rest of this fall is as we move through Mark, there's only so much I can do Sunday morning. So I'm going to pick up the pieces Sunday night. And so this morning we were looking at traditions and commandments, clean and unclean, what makes us unclean, and the fact that we are already unclean because of the sin that's a part of us. Y'all recognize that? What is that? That's the most famous frame in the world. It's the Mona Lisa frame. So the idea is that Mark didn't just go, okay, on March 2nd, Jesus did this. And on March 9th, Jesus did this. When we read the Gospels, it's not just information, but there is a story and a narrative that is being brought out. I took some, not classes, but seminars on orality. And there's been an interest in the last 20 years on orality, which has to do with people who are illiterate in their learning styles. Now, we in America think of someone who's illiterate as being ignorant, right? You know, if you can't read, what's wrong with you? But as they begin studying areas of the world where literacy has been limited until maybe the last 50, 60, 70 years, what they've discovered is, when you've got a book like this, anytime you need, or even more like this, where you can search it and find any verse at any time, just like that, your mind doesn't develop the muscles that somebody who is illiterate has to. Because if they can't write it down, if you can't write a note on a Post-it note or in your phone, what are you going to do? Well, you better remember it. And so you start developing different ways. And for people who were dealing with primarily oral as opposed to, what's the other word for, not written, but people who can read, literate. Literate learning styles versus oral learning styles. People which Mark and Jesus, all those people were dealing primarily with an oral learning style. And so what we're going to see tonight is that Mark takes elements of Jesus' story and he presents it in a way that furthers the gospel. So he's doing two things. He's telling us the facts about what Jesus did and what Jesus said, but then he's also placing it together to tell a story. And so what we have tonight, 2, maybe 3 healings. We might do 3 tonight. But there was 2 things that Jesus really did. He healed and he preached. And those are the things, and the teaching's pretty straightforward. Primarily it was in parable form. Why parable? So they could understand it better, but also so they could remember it. Because the stories that he told, with Paul, some of his concepts are so rich and deep. I mean, you basically need an outline. But with Jesus, you tell a story about a guy with a bag of seed or a guy with a son. And that's how people remember it. It's easier to understand, but it's portable and would stick with you. So The disciples were just like us, which there's hope for us. If there was hope for the disciples, there's hope for us. But part of it was that what he was doing was so unexpected. And that's kind of our danger today is we know what it means to be a Christian, right? And we just kind of get in a rut and we can go through the motions. We don't even have to use our brain to be a Christian some days, right? We just kind of go on autopilot. That's dangerous. That is very dangerous when we are doing Christian things simply because they're habit rather than motivated by the Spirit, motivated by our desire to please God because we're in relationship with Him. But even what we looked at this morning, that was a very radical concept because the thought was, I'm Jewish, I'm chosen. My great great ancestor was chosen by God and was guided by God. God destroyed Egypt in order to set my people free. God raised up Nebuchadnezzar and then put him down for my people. And so there was this idea of, and it was true, they were the chosen people, but they were chosen for a purpose. And they were chosen to serve God. They weren't chosen just to do whatever they wanted to do. And so this idea that they weren't perfectly holy would have been shocking to them, which is what John the Baptist was doing with his baptism, was coming to people who thought they were holy and saying, you need to be baptized. You need to be cleaned. So what Mark is doing is Mark is kind of, as he's going through the life of Jesus, he's presenting it in a certain way, and he uses specifically the healings as another parable. Jesus didn't use the healings as a parable. Jesus healed people. There were people who couldn't walk and then could walk. There were people who couldn't see and then they could see. People who couldn't speak and then they could speak because they encountered Jesus. But then there's also a parable that all of these illnesses, that Jesus, physical illnesses that Jesus was healing, have a spiritual component. And the way that Jesus approached them. You remember last time I was here, we talked about the most beautiful word. Any of you remember what the most beautiful word was? In English or Croatian? You got it. Gold star. Hoću. I am willing. And so Jesus healed a man, but also in that process of healing, there is a spiritual truth that comes out that we understand God is willing to reach us in our brokenness. He doesn't wait for us to come to Him. Not only is He able to heal, but He has a desire and a heart to heal. And so we see Mark using these encounters with people to show us a little bit about who Jesus was. And so let's turn to chapter 7 of Mark. We're going to look at the first healing. And so this is right after he's finished talking with them about what makes a person clean and what makes a person unclean. And so he's on the road again, verse 24. And from there he arose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Okay, these are two towns that are on the Mediterranean coast. And these were areas that were not part of Israel. The people who lived there were not Jews. either practicing Jews or by blood Jews. So he is in Gentile territory. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know. So here we see it again. Jesus is just getting crowded all the time, people surrounding him. He'd like to have some peace. He'd like to have some time with his disciples. Yet he could not be hidden. And so people are coming to him. Verse 25, but immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell at his feet. So people are hearing about Jesus, people who have no hope at all, nothing else possible. Jesus was the last chance for a lot of these people. Give him a shot. Nothing else has worked. And so she had heard about him. Question is, what had she heard about him? 26, now the woman was a Gentile and a Syro-Phoenician by birth. So mixed Syrian and Phoenician. The Phoenicians were the merchants of the ancient world. And all across the Mediterranean world, North Africa, the northern part of the Mediterranean, the Greeks had. But the eastern and southern part, the Phoenicians had, and would move from place to place. And Tyre was their main city. In the eastern Mediterranean. In the west, it was Carthage. And you may have heard about the struggle between the Romans and the Carthaginians. So this is a major trading center. And here's a woman who is not Jewish coming to Jesus, who is very Jewish. And she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And it's very, very interesting what Jesus says right here. Borderline offensive if you don't look at it closely. Jesus said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Who is Jesus talking about here? Who are the children and who are the dogs? All of us? We're the children? Yeah, this is a ethnic / racial statement that Jesus is making right here. That the children were the Jewish people. They were the children of Abraham, and by extension, the children of God. The chosen people. They are the children. And the dogs are the people who are not Jews, such as the woman that he's talking to right at this moment. He did not have his DEI class before he left heaven to understand how to be sensitive and not to offend. But if we look a little bit closer, I think Jesus says this. Obviously, Jesus knew who was coming to him. He knows who she was. But our English fails us at this moment. What he says is, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and to be thrown to the dogs. The word that he uses, and I don't think we have this in English. It's called a diminutive. Basically, what he's saying is it's a little dog. Like in Croatian, if you want to use the diminutive, you just put an each at the end of it. So like no one could pronounce Kaylee's name because we spelled it very weird. K-A-Y. They don't have a Y in their language. And then L-E-I-G-H. The I, G, and H are pretty much silent. And this was a 100% phonetic language. So they would be like, Kaylee. Didn't work. So a cookie is a keks. And keks, Kaylee. So they called her Keksich, which means a little cookie. That was her nickname, Keksich. And so that was a great thing. Learning another language is painful and humiliating, but after you're done with it, you pick up some nice things, and having the little iches on it. And that's what he's doing here. It's like to give it to the little dogs. So I think that Jesus was kind of jesting with her because the Gentiles knew what the Jews thought about them, that they called them dogs. The Jewish people called the Gentiles dogs. You see that in Philippians when I think it's chapter 3, where he's talking about the mutilators of the flesh. Beware the dogs. And Paul is using that term that the Jews used for the Gentiles on the Christians who were requiring men to be circumcised. He calls them dogs, which is that, I mean, these were, racism is not a product of the 21st century. It has always been there. Bigotry has always been there. So this woman would have known how the Jews felt about them, and quite frankly, they probably felt the same way about the Jews. Nobody got along. So I think Jesus is kind of making light of a situation here. That the children should be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Jesus came first to the Jews. That was the process of the gospel. These were God's chosen people, and they had been promised that a king would come. They had been promised that a Messiah would come. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been promised, and they kind of forgot this last part. The first part is that they would be blessed, and the second part is that they would be a blessing to all the people on earth. All peoples will be blessed through you. That was God's promise to Abraham. And that's exactly what he was doing in Christ. But it was first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. And the Gentile ministry didn't fully begin until Pentecost, when the Spirit came and it began to go out. So Jesus throws this out there. How does she reply? She replies right back at him. Yes, Lord. She doesn't take offense. Yet even the little dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. So if Jesus is kind of jesting with her, she comes right back at it. She won't be put off. She takes him as is, because this is her one shot. This is her one chance for her daughter. She doesn't take offense. Jesus comes like this. She comes right back. And he said to her, "For this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. And so it's important that we approach God as God. We can't negotiate with God. We understand that God is a loving God and a caring God. And when it appears like in this, on surface, this is insulting. But it wasn't. We have to approach God, as she did, and understand what He is able to do, and to understand His motivations and His goodness in spite of that. So then we have a second one that starts in verse 31. And he leaves Tyre and then goes north of the Sea of Galilee into the region of the Decapolis, which is what is today that area of Lebanon where the Hezbollah people are getting bombed, into Syria and all that kind of northeastern part of Galilee. There were 10 cities, the Decapolis, were probably towns. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And some of you might have this translated as being mute, that he was deaf and mute. Does anybody have that? Verse 32. Okay, which translation do you have? Okay. Anybody else have something other than that? Speech impediment. Yeah. Couldn't talk plain. Yeah. It's not that he couldn't talk, is that he had a problem with speaking. He couldn't speak clearly. And that's an important case because this is the only time in the New Testament that that condition is described. There's one time in the Old Testament when it's described, and I think that that is pointing back towards it. We'll get that in a second. So he was deaf and had a speech impediment, and his friends begged him to lay his hands on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, which is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. So there was no single recipe that Jesus had for healing people. Sometimes we have a case like this where he used his hands and spoke and prayed. But if we look at the previous healing, what did Jesus do to the little girl? He didn't do a thing. He didn't do anything. He said, it's done. And when she got home, it was done. So sometimes you see Jesus operating that way. Sometimes you see him operating in this way. But always, at the end, he says, tell no one. And always, they don't listen to him. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. Verse 37, and they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. So here you have it mute, but that wasn't his condition. But I think it's important to see that there was no recipe, there was no formula that Jesus had. There was no magic thing that he did to heal people. It was the kingdom of God coming into the broken world. And as the kingdom of God, the power of God, the presence of Jesus Christ came and encountered brokenness, the result was wholeness, healing, the way things are meant to be. People weren't meant to be deaf. People weren't meant to not be able to speak or talk. People weren't meant to be oppressed by spiritual forces. But because of the separation that started in the garden and continues into our lives today, we have brokenness. But when we encounter Christ, that brokenness finds a power that's more powerful than the brokenness. And so that is the picture that Mark is painting. Mark is painting of this invading force from heaven coming down in the person of Jesus Christ and coming and encountering broken thoughts about what makes a person clean and unclean. Broken thoughts about how I can please God. Broken thoughts about what pleases God. Broken thoughts about who my brother is and who's not my brother. So the teaching healed that brokenness, or had the opportunity to heal that brokenness. But then his physical presence there was changing all this. And what we're seeing is the fulfillment of prophecies of the day of the Lord that began when Jesus came. Now, I mentioned earlier I mentioned earlier about the only time in the New Testament that that word is used, about not being able to speak plainly. I've got a speech impediment. When I was in first grade, I had therapy, and I couldn't say my ahs. And for about a year, I had some kind of, and sometimes it slips out. Um, it hasn't affected my quality of life, um, but there's things that happen. But so, where does this condition? Where do we find this condition in the Old Testament? I said there's one place in the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. He said he did. I think he was just trying to get out of what the Lord was asking him to do. He started stammering. Yeah, I think he did. Moses did have one. Um, but it was funny. I mean, he seemed, there were times where it was there, and maybe it was stress induced. And certainly going down and telling Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, let my people go, that would have been stressful. That would have triggered a speech impediment, probably. But that's not the word that's used here. And so if you'll open Isaiah 35, we're going to read that chapter to see that this is what God had in mind when he sent Jesus. This is the promise of the gospel that we see fulfilled in Mark and Matthew, Luke, and John. And so I'd like to take some time to read. I was going to go on to a third one, but I don't think we'll do the third one. We'll do the third one next Sunday. I'll do it real quick. Sorry. Mark 8, I'm going to borrow. This is the sermon Sunday morning, but I'm going to borrow a little bit of it. The third healing, and we'll go through it real quick. 8:22, he comes to Bethsaida. That's where Peter was from. That's on the northern shore of Galilee. And they bring him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, led him outside the village, and when he spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he said, "Do you see anything?" And so once again, you see him touching him, using saliva. And so he's healed him, and the man looks up and says, "I see people, but they look like trees walking. Something's wrong." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home village, saying, "Don't tell anybody." Okay, so what's up? Was Jesus defective in that? That he couldn't get it right the first time? No, that's not what this is about. What this is about is he's painting a picture of talking about what happens when we're healed, and sometimes we need a correction. Because immediately after that, two things happen. Mark tells how Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ. That is the peak of the gospel. Everything is leading up to that point. The demons know who he is, but the disciples don't know who he is. The Pharisees don't know who he is. The crowds don't know who he is. Until this point, when God opens Peter's eyes. Jesus said, "This didn't come from you, but it came from my Father." This was revealed. You didn't figure this out because you're so smart, Peter. This was given to you as a gift to say who I am. He was the first of the disciples, the first person. But what happens immediately after that? When he sees who Jesus is, what happens immediately after that? Yeah. Peter starts telling him how to Messiah. Because he says, "Yeah, this has been given to you. This is who I am. By the way, I'm going to Jerusalem. They're going to beat me to a bloody pulp, nail me to a tree. I'm going to die. And then on the third day, I'll rise." And Peter goes, "No. No. What are you talking about?" No, Peter saw men walking around that looked like trees. even though he had just had his eyesight open. So you see what Mark's doing? Mark presents an, an encounter that really happened, but he places it in a way so that you can see this is what happened to Peter. Peter had his eyes opened, but he didn't see until Jesus corrected. And Jesus rebuked him and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have the things of God in mind, but the things of man." You see kind of how that goes together? I think so often we just kind of speed read through the Gospels and we miss these little things, but these are there for a purpose, to give us depth. So back to Isaiah, back to that man who couldn't speak clearly, and it's pointing to this chapter in Isaiah, written about 700 years previous, talking about what God was about to do. And so I'm just going to read through this real quick. Verse 35, chapter 35, verse 1. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. Remember, there was a voice crying in the wilderness. Not just a physical wilderness, but a spiritual wilderness, a barren spiritual wilderness where even the spiritual leaders, what we taught, that horrible example this morning about, sorry, you can't help your parents out because you've already promised that. No mercy, no care, just black and white. Spiritual wilderness. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the majesty of our God. And that's what they saw when Jesus walked around Galilee and when he walked over the top of Galilee. The glory of the Lord present there. They saw his face and they saw God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Basically, buck up. This is no time for cowardice. Say to those who have anxious hearts, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, and the recompense of God, he will come and save you. He will come and save you. And what happens when he comes and saves? Verse 5. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, physically and spiritually. The ears of the deaf unstopped, physically and spiritually. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute, not the mute, but the tongue of the person who, this is that word right here, same word in Greek, the person with a speech impediment, who can't talk, who stutters. What's going to happen to him? He's going to sing for joy. Couldn't talk, now he's singing. For waters break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals where they lie down, the grass shall become reeds and rushes. And a highway will be there. What's a highway? It's a straight path. It doesn't curve to the left. It doesn't curve to the right. It's been smoothed out. It doesn't go up. And it's the way to get there quick and direct and securely. The highway will be there, and it will be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it. It shall belong to those who walk on the way. And this is one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible right here. And even if they are fools. We got any fools in the house tonight? You might want to underline this one if you're in my department. Even if they are fools, they will not go astray. If you're walking with the Lord, you will not go astray. Now, if you stop walking with Him, guess what? You've already gone astray. But when you're walking with the Lord on that highway of holiness, and the holiness is His, it's not our holiness. He cleanses us. He places us on that highway and expects us to walk our life before Him in holiness, in His holiness, in righteousness, in His righteousness. Like what I was talking about this morning, I think there was a collective gasp when I mentioned fentanyl from the pulpit this morning. What I was trying to do was pick the worst possible example of something that you can put in your system. If you're lucky, it doesn't kill you. But you're addicted for the rest of your life. The worst possible thing that can exist doesn't come close to what we already have inside of us. What we have inside of us is worse than fentanyl. The only reason that fentanyl can hook us is because what's inside. And it grabs us and holds on to us. And any other kinds of thing. That's why it's a highway of holiness that the Lord seeks to build around us a hedge of protection to protect us from ourselves. Not from all those things outside, but the things inside of us that are looking for all those things. And even if we are fools, we will not go astray. Verse 9, no lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And this is what happened 2,000 years ago and has been happening ever since the resurrection. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. This is not Zion, the hill of Jerusalem, but this is returning to the Lord, returning to our God, who we spent our life walking away from, and because of the cross, we make our way back. And we come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be on their heads, and they shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. That was a promise that was held for 700 years. 700 years people waited for that. And then it came. And they didn't recognize it. And they rejected it. And they killed Him. And God took that to make us who we are today. He can't be stopped. He won't be stopped. He'll find a way. So we will close there for this evening. I think we have another song to close. I want to say real quick, we will be scheduling a baptism within the next few months. If there's anyone else who would like to inquire about baptism, come and talk with me. We can talk about it. Next week we will announce the date. But if there's anyone who would like to talk about that, what that means, please reach out to me. Yes, sir.
Before we close, there's another prayer time in Monroe this Thursday.
Okay.
Anyone's interested, I think it starts at 6.
Is that there on the square again? Okay. 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 Yeah, we can put that announcement out. Definitely need to be praying for our city and our country.